So, if you don't know already, today one of Formula One's best drivers of the early 1980s has sadly passed away in Patrick Tambay. So, who was he? So, Patrick Tambay started racing in the early 1970s, 1972, and he finished ninth in the European Formula Renault series. A couple of years later, he moved up from Formula Renault after finishing third place in the championship and ended up racing in Formula 2 for 3 years, coming in second in his second season. This meant that he managed to get a Formula 1 seat in 1977 with the Theodore team, and he spent half a season with them and scored a good amount of points. He moved to McLaren in 1978 after doing a race with them in 1977. However, he didn't have much success with them, as this was when McLaren went downhill before they were obviously taken over by Ron Dennis and his Project 3 racing program, which of course led to many successes for McLaren in the 1980s and 1990s, and even the 2000s to a degree. So Tambay managed to get a Formula 1 seat, and he was on the grid for a few years. He didn't score very many points because he was in cars which were often not good enough for him compared to his quality. You could say a similar thing about midfield drivers in Formula 1 like Sergio Perez, up until Perez managed to get his move to Red Bull. And Tambay had a similar story where he was in poor cars for most of the start of his career until 1982, and we'll get onto that in a minute. He raced in Can-Am for a man called Karl Haas, no relation to Gene Haas, the owner of the current Haas Formula 1 team, and would later race for him in Formula 1. Now, quick fact about Karl Haas, the same team that he owned, that Patrick Tambay won Can-Am championships for, was later the team which he co-owned alongside racing legend, and for those of you who might be younger, similar age to me, voiced Doc Hudson in Cars, Paul Newman, who was a massive fan of motor racing. And he's not like all them celebrities that just show up on the grid. He actually competed in motor racing, but that's for a different video. So Tambay was racing for mid-table teams up until the 1982 season, and this is when his career really hit its peak, because in 1982 Formula 1 was an extremely dangerous sport. Not as dangerous as it had been when Tambay had started in the sport, however it was still quite a dangerous sport. And unfortunately, at the Belgian Grand Prix, Gilles Villeneuve lost his life in qualifying. And as a result of this, Ferrari needed to find a driver to replace him for the round, not the round after Belgium, but the round after that, because of the fact that Ferrari didn't race the following race. And they chose Tambay because he was a very experienced driver who had driven in Formula 1 previously and had a lot of credentials, such as finishing second in Formula 2, like I said, which was a pretty good achievement considering drivers that won the championships included the likes of Ronnie Peterson, who took 10 Formula 1 race wins, Jackie X, who also took 10 Formula 1 race wins, and other drivers who weren't as successful but still got Formula 1 seats nonetheless, meaning that Formula 2 was as successful then as it is now, as of course Formula 2 graduates such as Oscar Piastri, Mick Schumacher, Charles Leclerc, George Russell and Nick de Vries have all ended up racing in Formula 1. De Vries' path was a bit different, as was Piastri's, as they took a couple years in other sports beforehand, while Piastri was just a test driver. However, Formula 2 was a very successful championship back then. It had champions such as Marc Surer, Johnny Servoz-Gavan, Patrick Tambay, and Jacques Lafitte, and René Arnoux. And when Tambay came into Formula 1, it was the French Revolution, really. Renault had just come into Formula 1, and there were some incredible talents on the grid, as there was two teams, Renault and Ligier, and there was drivers such as Jacques Lafitte, Patrick Tambay, Tambay, Arnoux, and the field was just incredible. Soon after, Alain Prost had joined as well, and Renault had become an all-French team with those two at the wheel. Jean-Pierre Jabouille was another driver who was very talented, but he was probably better as an engineer. Tambay, got confused with a different a different Patrick there. Tambay raced in Formula One for Ferrari, and within a couple of races, he was already on the mark, fighting for race wins, and his win came at a much needed time for Ferrari, because not only did Villeneuve unfortunately lose his life, but Didier Pironi was seriously injured in an accident at the German Grand Prix. He was another brilliant French driver who actually was good friends with Villeneuve until the San Marino Grand Prix that year, but that's again for a different video. And Tambay won that race, and he managed to help Ferrari keep their chances of winning the Constructors' Championship alive. And not only was he rewarded for this, because Ferrari did end up winning the Constructors in the end, despite having had 4 drivers throughout the year, as Mario Andretti competed in the last few rounds of the season, and because of Pironi's injury, and because of Villeneuve's unfortunate passing, Tambay came in and did a brilliant job, and he was rewarded with a permanent drive at Ferrari, and he won a race the following year and again helped Ferrari win the Constructors alongside René Arnoux. They finished 3rd and 4th in the championship, Arnoux 3rd and Tambay 4th, but Tambay was dropped the following season for an Italian by the name of Michele Alboreto, because Alboreto was in fine form for Tyrrell. So Tambay then got a seat at Renault. However, Renault, this was the start of the downfall of Renault in their first stint in Formula 1, as they hit their ceiling in 1982 really. Their main problem was they had too many mechanical problems. They had half of the races in 1982 had a Renault starting first. But they didn't finish a lot of races, and that was why neither Alain Prost nor René Arnoux could win the championship in 1982. And in 1983, they did have a very good year. Prost did fight for the World Championship right until the end. However, it was yet again unreliability that cost him the title in the end to Brabham's Nelson Piquet. And when Tambay joined in 1984, they started to fall off slightly. And by the end of 1984, he'd only had a couple of podiums that year, which was really poor, because in the previous seasons he had won races and got podiums quite often. And so he moved to Haas Lola, and he didn't have any success with them, because Haas Lola was a team that was run on a very shoestring budget, because they didn't have any big investors. Their sponsors was a food company called Beatrice Foods. And Haas Lola, like I said, they were partnered up with Lola, and Lola, they never had any incredible success in Formula 1, because they had, the best thing that they had done was really provide John Surtees a platform in the 1960s, which he would eventually use to move on to Ferrari and win world championships. But yeah, I'd say that Tambay had a very, very good career. However, he very often was in machinery which wasn't as good as his actual talents, and he won stuff outside of Formula 1, which showed that he was a good driver. And hearing the news that he passed away, was very sad today, because that's another driver from a previous era that's passed away, because of course Didier Pironi passed away in 1988, Gilles Villeneuve of course passed away in 1982, multiple other drivers that were on the 1982 grid have since passed away, Carlos Reutemann being one of them. He passed away last year, and Mauro Forghieri, who was the guy who was involved in designing the cars that Tambay drove, he passed away earlier on this year as well, at the age of 87. So there are more and more people who are passing away from the older eras. Of course, in the last 6 years, we've lost guys such as John Surtees, Carlos Reutemann, like I said, and it's really sad that there's so many motorsport legends that are passing away. But of course, this has happened before, drivers from the 50s passing away, and it's just sort of how life runs, really. And the fact that these guys have lived so long is so surprising. I mean, Tambay was only 73, but if you keep in mind, he raced in an extremely dangerous era of Formula 1. During his Formula 1 career, Ronnie Peterson, Patrick Tambay, Gilles Villeneuve, Riccardo Paletti, and Elio De Angelis had all lost their lives in Formula One cars. And because he raced from 1977 to 1986 in Formula One. Later on, he raced in a series which didn't last very long called Grand Prix Legends, where a bunch of old drivers competed. It wasn't a good idea from the start because a bunch of the older drivers were extremely unfit, and he was one of the ones which wasn't exactly in shape. And a story relating to that, Alan Jones said to the guy who said, one of the drivers was called Christian Danner. He was Formula 3000 champion in 1985, and he said about Alan Jones and about Tambay that they weren't very fit, and Alan Jones, being Alan Jones, responded saying the only time that Danner had seen a podium was when he was on his way back from the lavatory, when he was on his way to the lavatory, which is true kind of, because Danner never got a podium in Formula 1, unlike most of the other drivers in that series, and in the end the series is dissolved, and Tambay sort of was well, we didn't really hear from him very much. I think he became a politician, in fact. His son Adrian competed in motor racing. He was a decent driver, but nothing compared to his father. I mean, it's quite tricky when your father's won 2 Formula 1 races for Ferrari. I mean, that's just automatically put you on pressure 100. But yeah, hearing the news today was quite sad. He passed away due to complications from Parkinson's disease, and I hope and pray that we find a cure for that soon, because it's a horrible disease which has ruined far too many lives. But thank you all for watching this video on who Patrick Tambay was, and yeah, I will see you all in the next video. Bye. And if you haven't already, consider hitting the like button, and well, we're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers, so if you could subscribe, that would be fantastic. See you all later.